Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good
Bueno,
evening. I'm Lisa Moon, President and CEO of the Global Food Banking Network. And thank you for joining us for this session of the virtual Food Bank Leadership Institute entitled The Future of Food Security with Dr. Robert L. Thompson. Dr. Thompson is Professor Emeritus at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and he is also a Senior Fellow in Global Agricultural Development and Food Security with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. He is an agricultural economist by training, and Dr. Thompson has had a storied career, including serving as Dean of Agriculture at Purdue University, Director and Senior Advisor of Rural Development at the World Bank, Chairman Emeritus of the International Food and Agricultural Trade and Policy Council. He was actually raised on a small dairy family farm in northern New York State, but he has had extensive international experience, having lectured or consulted or conducted research in more than 90 countries worldwide, including extended periods in Denmark, Laos, and Brazil. Dr. Thompson, we're so grateful to have you with us today and are very much so looking forward to what you're going to share with us.
Thank you, Lisa, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening if you're in the Far East. My theme today is the future of food security, and it's important that as we start this discussion, to recognize that in 2015, the United Nations General Assembly adopted 17 Sustainable Development Goals with the objective of achieving these goals by the year 2030. Now, the first three of these are to eliminate poverty, to eliminate hunger, and to ensure good health and well-being. We're going to focus on these this morning under our theme of the future of food security. But as you'll see, what we're going to be talking about touches on many of the other Sustainable Development Goals as well. Now, when we're talking about food security, it's important that we're all on the same page in terms of what we're talking about, because there are really three distinct concepts of food security. All are important, and we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about two of the three today. The first question, global food security, is basically the question: can the world's farmers feed its larger population better than today at reasonable cost without damaging the environment? Will there be enough food to feed the world's future larger population? We'll spend most of the second half of my presentation addressing this issue. The second concept of food security is national food security. And every government has to ensure that its people have a reliable, safe and nutritious, reasonably priced supply of food available from some combination of domestic production and imports. And so the basic question here is, what is the potential for self-sufficiency that is both economically efficient and environmentally sustainable in each country? Now, this is the area of food security that we're not going to spend much time on today. But the third concept, household food security, is where we're going to start. And with that, there are really three aspects of household food security. The first question concerns the availability of food. It's really the question of, is there a safe, reliable, and reasonably priced supply of all essential nutrients, that is, vitamins, minerals, calories, amino acids? Is there a safe, reliable, reasonably priced supply of all essential nutrients available from local production or from the market year-round? Is there food available? Second question, access. This is, does a household have the purchasing power to access a nutritionally balanced diet from homegrown sources or from the marketplace? And purchasing power is really the most important issue here. It's the income of the family adjusted for the cost of living. And of course, for very low income people, food is the largest single component of what they have to spend money on. So the price of food plays in very much to the ability of a household to access whatever food is available in the marketplace. And the third aspect of household food security is utilization. Is a person healthy enough so that the nutrients that are consumed can actually be absorbed and used by the body? We won't spend time on this aspect today, but it is important to have that in mind. So let's start with a bit of history. It took from the beginning of time until 1804, that's about the time that Thomas Jefferson was president of the United States. It took from the beginning of time to 1804 to get to the first billion people on the earth. But it only took 123 years before the second billion was added, and 33 years to the third billion, and 14 more years to the fourth billion, and 13 years for the fifth billion. And the last several billion, from 5 to 6 and 6 to 7, and now projected 7 to 8, is taking about 12 years each. Now, that means that we've been adding about 80 million people per year to the world's population. To put that in perspective, we've basically been adding another Germany to the world's population every year, really since the turn of the century. Now, in 1798, Thomas Malthus wrote that food production could not keep up with population growth and that starvation would limit the size of the world's population. Well, Malthus was writing a little before the first billion people were on the face of the earth, and so he clearly was wrong. That Malthus did get it wrong, because with the development of ocean shipping, vast new areas of land were brought into agricultural production in North and South America, as well as in Oceania, Australia, and New Zealand. Engineering research developed machines that made it possible for every farmer to cultivate larger areas of land and to manage larger herds of livestock and larger flocks of poultry. There was research in genetics, particularly in the 19th century, and also research on control of insects, diseases, and weeds resulted in big increases in the production per hectare of land and also production per farm animal. So instead of limiting population as Malthus predicted, global food output has actually grown slightly faster than consumption over these several hundred years. The long-term trend in the price of food has been downward slightly after taking out the effects of inflation. And as we'll see, the world's population is now larger than 7.8 billion people. So, but all is not well. While there may be plenty of food grown in the world, millions of people have been left behind with inadequate diets. Diets that are deficient in calories, vitamins, minerals, and/or amino acids. According to the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, before COVID struck last year, there was an estimated 750 million people, that's 1 out of every 10 people in the world, were affected by what they called severe food insecurity. And of that number, 690 million were classified as hungry, going to bed hungry. And in their analysis, their definition of hungry is basically ties back to the issue of purchasing power. Hungry means that a household simply lacks sufficient purchasing power to access even 1,800 calories per day. That's not enough for an adult to put in a medium level of physical activity, and certainly not enough for children to thrive in school. Now, hunger and food insecurity are widespread. War, natural disasters, economic crises all cause a great deal of hunger in the world. But we have to remember that chronic hunger is mostly dependent on poverty. Emergency programs like yours with the food banks play an essential role in addressing such human crises. And there will always, unfortunately, be short-term local crises. However, if we really want to solve the world's chronic hunger problems, and that's Sustainable Development Goal number 2, as we've seen, the world's poverty problem must also be solved. That's Sustainable Development Goal number 1. These are intimately intertwined. But an important thing for us to keep in mind that I haven't mentioned already is that prior to COVID, 80% of the extreme poverty in the world is rural. Most of these people are farmers. The majority are female. Half are children. And most of these people have little or no schooling. And a point that surprises many, because they have so little land and so few resources, despite being farmers, most of the world poor are net food buyers, even the farmers. So turning now to the issue of poverty, there really has been incredible progress made at reducing poverty and the associated hunger over the last 3 decades. If you look at these two graphs, on the left, we have the global poverty rate. That's the percent of the world's population suffering from extreme poverty, which the World Bank has defined as less than $1.90 a day, which is adjusted for differences across countries in purchasing power. So these are apples to apples comparisons across countries. But the global poverty rate was 37% as recently as 1990. That's more than 1 out of every 3 people in the world was suffering from severe poverty. That fell to less than 10% or slightly less than 10% by the year 2017, the last year for which we have complete data. Now, in terms of numbers, that was almost 2 billion people out of the world's smaller population back in 1990. And that number of the extreme poor had fallen to about 700 million by 2017. Now, unfortunately, COVID-19 has reversed a lot of this progress. According to the Pew Research Institute, their analysis suggests that COVID-19 has pushed about 131 billion people across the world back into extreme poverty. Now, these new poor, as they've characterized them, tend to be more urban than rural. Remember, we said that before COVID, 80% of the world's extreme poor lived in rural areas. Now, it turns out that much of the increase in poverty in the last year due to COVID has been in the cities. So it's more urban than rural. Most of the people live in congested urban settings, working in sectors that are affected by lockdowns and mobility restrictions. They're more engaged in informal services or manufacturing, including food processing, than in farming. And we know that food supply chains or food availability has been disrupted in some places, and global food prices have been rising. In fact, global food prices have risen steadily in the last 10 months, reaching the highest level today that they've been in the last 7 years. Now, the impact of COVID-19 on increasing poverty has been disproportionate around the world. All regions have been affected, but the projected increase in global poverty has been concentrated in 2 regions. In South Asia, that's India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal. South Asia, the increase is estimated at 78 million. And secondly, in Sub-Saharan Africa, where the increase in poor is estimated at 40 million. It will take years to make up for the years of progress in reducing poverty and associated food insecurity that have been lost. There will be plenty of work for food banks like yours and for other food aid programs to do in this period. Okay, now let's turn to our central theme of today, the prospects for the future of global food security. Now, before COVID-19, these were the projections of world population between 2020 and 2050 for the next 29 years now. The projection of the Population Reference Bureau, which is my choice of demographic research institutes, they project that the world's population will grow by just over 2 billion people. That's 2 billion more mouths to be fed between now and 2050, the middle of this century. Virtually all of this growth will be in low-income countries. In fact, their projection was only 90 million out of more than 2.1 billion would be in high-income countries. So more than 2 billion would be added to the demand or the number of people to be fed in low to middle income countries. I want to focus your attention on the lines emphasized in red, because most of this increase in population will be in South and Central Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. South Central Asia, which has a little over 2 billion people in their current population, is projected to add another 500 million, roughly 515 million more mouths to be fed. But what I find most challenging and perhaps even a bit shocking is that in Sub-Saharan Africa, this is the only region of the world projected to more than double its population between now and 2050, with population projected to grow from just over 1.1 billion people today to almost 2.2 billion in 2050. And the one other number I would focus your attention on here in the bottom line, North Africa and West Asia are not large populations in terms of the totality of the world, but their population is also growing fairly rapidly and are projected to add over 250 million additional mouths to be fed by the middle of the century. So when we look at population growth projections, the important thing to recognize is that this creates need for additional food production. But population growth alone does not create demand for food. It only creates need. Now let's turn to the issue of what are the dynamics of food demand growth. We know that very low income people, extremely low income people, the kind that we saw on the previous chart, that they spend virtually all of their income on the needs of life: food, shelter, clothing. They spend the largest fraction of their incomes on food. And so as their incomes start to rise, they spend most of the first increments of income on food. By about $2 per day, most of their hunger problems can be addressed. That is, they have the ability to access enough calories so they're not going to starve to death. But by no stretch of the imagination are their diets balanced in the sense of getting enough vitamins, minerals, and amino acids to have quality health, the Sustainable Development Goal number 3. But as their incomes rise, as we successfully reduce poverty from $2 to $10 a day per capita, this is the range of incomes when most people start to eat some meat, or at least other plant proteins. Most people consume more dairy products, fruits, vegetables, edible oils. This is the range of income where we get the absolutely maximum rate of growth and demand for raw agricultural products. So ironically, when we're successful at reducing poverty, we unleash the most rapid increase in demand for raw agricultural products. Because once people get to about $10 a day per capita income, any additional increments of income don't get spent, or not much of them get spent on eating more physical volume of food. They buy more processing, more services, more packaging, more variety, maybe more luxury forms, but not more raw agricultural products. So let's look at the regional distribution of poverty. This chart for 2015, the last year for which I could find complete data, this shows the incidence of extreme poverty around the world. And as we see here, Sub-Saharan Africa had an estimated 413 million extremely poor. That was 41% of the entire population of Africa south of the Sahara. South Asia had the second largest incidence of poverty, with about 216 million people, or just over 1 out of every 8 people suffering from extreme poverty in that region. Now, East Asia and the Pacific, particularly China, is the region of the world that's enjoyed the most rapid reduction in poverty, actually in the history of the world over the last several decades. And in 2015, only about 2.3% of the population of that region was categorized as suffering extreme poverty. Latin America and Caribbean had another 26 million. Middle East and North Africa, 18, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, perhaps 7, for an estimated roughly 736 million people, or 10% of the world's population, suffering extreme poverty in 2015. Now, population growth alone, as we've seen, does not create need, or creates need, but doesn't create demand for food. That, when you add the income, successful poverty reduction or income to the population, this creates the capacity to access diets. But there's one other factor when we're considering future demand for food we have to take into account, and that's urbanization. Because as people move from rural to urban areas, they find a lot more variety of possible foods to consume, foods that were never available in the rural areas that they came from. For the first time in the history of humanity, a little bit since the beginning of the 21st century, was the first time that urban population exceeded the rural population. But the United Nations Population Office projects now that 60% of the world's population will live in cities by the year 2030, just a few years from now, and 70% of the world's population will live in cities by 2050. So in addition to population growth and income growth, we also have to take the growing urbanization into account when we're projecting future demand for food. So now let's put this all together. What does it add up to? My assessment is that with the population growing by 27%, from 7.8 to 9.9 billion people between now and the middle of the century, when you add in the effect of likely urbanization and assumed rate of poverty reduction, changing dietary patterns, that I project that the world demand for food will grow probably 50 to 60% by 2050. Now, the FAO estimates that roughly 1/3 of the food produced in the world gets lost between the farmer's field and the point of consumption. That in low-income countries in particular, there are significant losses of agricultural products as they move through the marketing system, as a result of poor storage, poor transport systems, lack of refrigeration, so that there's a great deal of loss in low-income countries between the farmer's field and retail. In high-income countries, there's a great deal of food waste from retail to the garbage pail, if you will. So it's really immoral to see so much of the world's resources go into food production that ends up being wasted after it's actually grown. Now, I don't believe for a minute that we can completely eliminate post-harvest losses, but it would be a good target to at least cut them by half. So I'm assuming that if we can cut the losses by half, and I know you folks in the food banks are doing a lot to intercept food that might otherwise have gone to waste, and making sure that it gets into the hands of low-income people who can't afford an adequate diet. But if we could cut the losses by half. I estimate that world food production will still have to grow by over 40% between now and 2050. And to add complexity to this challenge, climate change is shifting all agroecological zones and increasing the frequency of extreme climatic events. And we'll turn to climate change again a little later in my presentation. But for now, let's look at the issue of how do we achieve this goal of increasing food production by, say, 40% over the next 30 years. We have to start with land. Land and water are the two most fundamental resources in food production. But let's start and take a look at the distribution of land resources around the world. And it's important to recognize that cropland is distributed in very different proportions around this planet than the population is. If you look at my two pie graphs here, on the right, I have the percentage distribution of world population by regions of the world. And on the left, I have the percentage distribution of arable land by regions around the world. I'd like to focus your attention on the red wedges on the right and the orange wedges on the left. The red wedges represent East Asia and the Pacific, and the orange wedges on the left represent South Asia. Taking these two regions together, we see that they have more than twice as much of the world's population than they do of the arable land. In fact, virtually all the arable land in these two regions is already in production. Now, let's look at the turquoise wedge in the southwest corner of the two charts. This is Middle East and North Africa, a little bit more of the world's population than of the arable land, but not too big a mismatch there. But of course, what this region lacks is enough fresh water. Now, there's one more wedge in this chart, these charts that I want to focus your attention on, and that's Sub-Saharan Africa. 13% of the world's population when I did this analysis, 15% of the arable land. But if you'll think back to our population growth projections, this is the one region of the world that's projected to more than double its population in the coming 30 years. The only region of the world that's expected to have population grow by that much. As we'll see, agriculture in Sub-Saharan Africa has tended to underperform relative to its potential, but we'll come back to that in a few minutes. But one of the biggest question marks we have about future food security is exactly in this region of Sub-Saharan Africa, where demand for food as a result of population growth, urbanization, and poverty reduction, demand for food is virtually exploding in this region. The big question then is how much will they contribute to their own food supply or become dependent on other regions of the world? Okay, as I said before, land is the most fundamental resource undergirding our food production capacity. Just so we're all on the same page, this map of croplands of the earth shows you where most of the food production capacity resides. This is a map based on satellite imagery, and the way to interpret it is the darker the shading, the larger the percentage of the land under that pixel, which is already in crop production. So we see, particularly across the Northern Hemisphere, you see a lot, the Midwest of the United States extending up into the Canadian prairies, Western and Eastern Europe, South Asia, China, Southeast Asia, all quite dark, all with most of the available land already in crop production. The shading is quite a bit lighter in the Southern Hemisphere in South America and Sub-Saharan Africa. And as we'll see, these are the two regions where there is some additional land that could be brought into production. Now, when we're talking about land availability, there's a second category that we have to be sure to remember, and this is grazing lands. Grazing lands are lands that don't get enough rainfall to be an annual crop production. They can't grow grains or much fruits and vegetables, at least without irrigation, but they can grow grass, and they can grow enough grass so that on which ruminant livestock can graze, and ruminant livestock, of course, can convert grass into milk and meat, and thereby contribute to the world's food supply. In fact, there's an even larger area of land available in the world for grazing than there is for annual cropping. Now, just to remind, ruminants include not only cattle, sheep, and goats, but also buffalo, water buffalo, bison, also deer, and even camels. And all of these are sources of potential meat and milk supply for the world's population. And we'd truly be remiss if we didn't acknowledge the important contribution that they all play to global food supply on lands that simply don't get enough rainfall to be able to contribute much in grain production. So now let's go back to the land constraint, the cropland constraint, and explore the potential. There's at most 10% more land available worldwide that isn't presently forested or subject to erosion or desertification. And we know that loss and degradation of many soils continues year after year. As a result of urbanization and construction of infrastructure, we're paving over a lot of prime agricultural land. We're using up the nutrients in many soils and not replenishing them through organic and inorganic forms of fertilization, through inadequate conservation measures. There's a lot of land that's being eroded. Some is suffering desertification. There are natural reserves. And in some parts of the world, we are successfully implementing reforestation. All of these reducing the area of cropland available. So whether there's actually 10% net more land available or not is subject to question. Now, the area of land in farm production could probably be expanded by more than 10%, but only by destruction of forests with accompanying loss of wildlife habitat, loss of biodiversity, loss of carbon sequestration capacity, accelerating global warming. And of course, if we burn forests to clear them, that means that carbon that was sequestered millions of years ago in the form of those trees is going up in smoke and going back into the atmosphere, increasing the density of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So this leads me to the inescapable conclusion that the only environmentally sustainable alternative is to increase productivity on the fertile, non-erodible soils that are already in crop production around the world. And as I suggested when we looked at the cropland map of the world, most of the available cropland is in remote areas in South America and Sub-Saharan Africa, where infrastructure is minimal and soils are generally inferior in quality to those already in annual crop production. So now let's turn to the second most important resource on which food production is based, and that's water. Water is a growing constraint on future food supply and may even be a greater constraint than land availability. It's estimated that farmers account for 70% of the world's fresh water use in their irrigation practices. With rapid urbanization underway, and remember the projection that 70% of the world's population will live in cities by 2050, with that rapid urbanization underway, cities are already outbidding agriculture for available fresh water. We see it happening in California. We see it happening in other parts of the world. And I can tell you that if 70% of the world's population is living in cities by the middle of the century, the world's farmers are not going to have access to 70% of the fresh water for their irrigation. So the world's farmers who are being called upon to increase agriculture production by perhaps 40% are going to have to do it using less fresh water than they're using today in total. In other words, they're going to have to increase the crop per drop, the average productivity of the water they use. And this is certainly going to require investments in research to develop water-saving technologies and to increase the drought tolerance and water use efficiency in the crop varieties that they're already growing. Now, there is one source of optimism, that the productivity of the water used in agriculture can be increased. Water is priced at zero to most of the world's farmers, signaling to them that it's much more abundant than it is in reality. Because really anything that's priced at zero will be wasted. Fortunately, there are better technologies available today to increase water use efficiencies than many farmers are using in many parts of the world. But with water priced at zero, it simply does not pay to adopt those technologies. Things like drip irrigation, which can be costly to implement, but can vastly increase the productivity of the water that's used. So my bottom line here is, if the politically difficult hurdle of starting to charge farmers for the water they use can be overcome, this would stimulate adoption of these available technologies. Somehow we're going to have to find an adequate incentive to induce the world's farmers to use the water they use more efficiently. Okay, now to put this together, as we look around the world at the challenge of increasing agricultural output at least 40% in the next 30 years, one thing we do observe is the agricultural sector in many low-income countries is underperforming relative to its potential. It would be consistent with both economic efficiency and environmental sustainability. In other words, the farm sectors of those countries are producing less food and less cash income for farm households, and they're contributing less output to their national food supply than they could be in both an economically efficient and an environmentally sustainable manner. Now, where are these opportunities? To get a handle on this, let's look at what are termed crop yield gaps. These are estimates by agronomists of how much of the potential yield with presently available technologies, or technologies that are available somewhere in the world, how much of that potential yield are farmers actually achieving? Now, in the upper right, this barred graph illustrates these crop yield gaps, and we'll look at them in detail in a second. In the lower left is a map that's highly stylized and summarizes an index of the yields of the three largest cereal grains, wheat, rice, and maize, that summarizes the crop yield levels in major regions of the world. The way to interpret that map in the lower left is the highest yields are red, the lowest are blue. So as you move across the color rainbow, from blue to red, you go from lowest to highest yield. So you see the highest yields in the red and orange and yellow regions are in the central west of the United States, Western Europe, China, and the rest of East Asia. The lowest in blue you see are particularly concentrated in Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, and most of South America are in the middle range. Or if we look up at the crop yield potential, we see that East Asia is estimated to be achieving 90% of, or almost 90% of yield potential. These are very heavily fertilizing regions using a lot of irrigation. There just isn't a lot more that can be done there. On the other hand, Central Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Central America, and Caribbean tend to be on the other extreme, with Sub-Saharan Africa estimated to be achieving only 25% of potential yield. And remember, this is with presently available technologies. So in other words, without going into greater detail at this point, there's a lot of potential to increase productivity using presently available technologies in many parts of the world, and in particular in parts of the world that are projected to have relatively rapid increases in population and have the potential through successful poverty alleviation to significantly increase demand for food. So to summarize the sources of these different observed differences in crop yields in different parts of the world, one of these sources is genetic potential embodied in the seeds of the crops being produced. Simply, traditional varieties may not have or often don't have sufficient genetic potential to achieve high productivity, even with plenty of nutrients in the soil and successful pest control. Climatic conditions vary around the world. This is the level and variation in temperature and precipitation. And as we'll talk about in a minute, these are changing. Quality of the soil varies significantly among regions of the world, although it can frequently be corrected through fertilization with both organic and inorganic fertilizers. Soils can vary in their water holding capacity. We know that sand, for example, in more desert regions has very low water holding capacity. And some soils are much more subject to erosion than others, so that some soils have greater resilience, just inherent capacity to avoid irrigation. Various regions of the world have significant differences in the extent to which they're supplementing the inherent soil fertility and the fertility that's used up by crops. Again, supplementation through organic and inorganic fertilizers. Also, the extent to which they supplement precipitation through irrigation. For example, only 3 or 4% of the irrigation potential of Sub-Saharan Africa has actually been developed. And yields across and regions of the world vary greatly in the extent to which they're successful in controlling losses of yield potential from inadequate control of disease and insect infestations, or from competition for nutrients and water and light from weeds. So I've alluded to climate change several times, so let's turn and address it specifically. We know that climates are changing. Global warming is occurring. What doesn't get a lot of attention in the popular media reporting on climate change is that the warming is greater over land than over water, and it's much greater at the higher latitudes near the North and South Pole than it is at the equator. So if we're talking about a 1 or 2 degree increase in the average global temperature, we may be talking about an 8 degree Celsius increase in temperature in Canada and in Siberia, for example. We know that climate change is shifting the spatial distribution of precipitation. Some regions are projected to suffer loss of rainfall, such as southwest of the United States and much of the Mediterranean basin. Some regions are projected to enjoy greater precipitation. But perhaps the most significant factor in climate change, at least in my estimation, affecting future food production capacity, is the increased frequency of extreme climatic events, extreme droughts, extreme flooding, extreme tornadic activity, extreme cold in the winter, just greater extremes occurring more frequently. We've observed a lot of this in the last few years in a number of regions of the world. Now, I'll just summarize briefly some of the effects of climate change. Now, one of the few positives for agriculture is a higher carbon dioxide concentration does enhance the plant growth, particularly in certain species. We know that carbon dioxide is the raw material of photosynthesis, which converts carbon dioxide or takes in carbon dioxide and releases oxygen. So carbon sequestration is an important function of crop production in agriculture. Higher temperature extends the growing season in the high latitudes. I mentioned Canada and Siberia already. The higher temperatures are likely to be detrimental in lower latitudes near the equator. We know that water availability is changing in different regions. So there's likely to be an increased need for investment in irrigation capacity in some regions, particularly to reduce the risk associated with more frequent extreme climatic events. We know that agriculture is an inherently risky business, and it's just likely to be a more risky business in the future because of this change in climate. As warming occurs, as we migrate north and south from the equator, this means that there'll be greater proliferation of pests and plant diseases further north in the northern hemisphere, further south in the southern hemisphere. We know that sea level is rising, and this will cause loss of some cropland. I think in particular Bangladesh, where the potential loss of cropland is projected to be particularly severe. Other low-lying lands, and particularly some island states in the Pacific. And if we have more frequent heavy rainfall, when rain occurs, this is likely to cause greater erosion and loss of soil fertility from greater surface water runoff. So adaptation is going to be required due to global climate change. As all agroecosystems shift with climate change, larger investments in adaptive plant and animal breeding are needed just to sustain present productivity levels. Let me repeat that. It's going to take larger investments in adaptive plant and animal breeding just to sustain the present productivity levels. And because of the increased frequency of extreme climatic events, we need to breed in more resilience, more tolerance to drought as well as heat. Some regions of the world are simply going to have to change the mix of what crops are produced in those locations. It's simply the change in climate will be too great to adjust those specific species sufficiently. And I believe that because of the shifts in agroecosystems, we're likely to see a necessity for more of world agriculture production to move through international trade. And this will also be important as helping to ensure annual food security. If countries experience severe adverse climatic events in a given year that really impact in a negative manner their crop yields, they may have to rely more on trade, on imports, to make up for the losses in those years. On the other hand, in really good crop years, they'll welcome the opportunity to sell the excess out onto the world market. So freer and more open international trading system is likely to also be an important component of ensuring national food security in specific years. Now, fortunately, we are living in the golden age of the biological and information sciences. Modern science gives us incredible potential. We've seen, for example, in the last year, the ability to develop vaccines against COVID-19 at incredible rates, and much of that same modern biological science gives us the capacity to do things like improving the nutritional content of staples, like augmenting deficient vitamins, minerals, and amino acids in some of our staples. Rice, for example, lacks vitamin A. We know that deficiency in vitamin A in in regions of the world where a couple billion people depend on rice as their principal staple, that there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who suffer eye maladies and blindness as a result of that lack of vitamin A. The golden rice, which has been developed, which has more vitamin A in it than traditional rice varieties, means that if people consume this high vitamin A rice, that you should have significant reduction in those eye diseases associated with vitamin A deficiencies. There are lots of possibilities for augmenting the nutritional content of our staples. We need to draw upon modern biological science to increase the tolerance to drought, to wetness, to high or low temperatures, to salt, to increase yields, and or also to make it possible to plant a larger area that's under adverse or variable conditions. For example, if you have high salt content in the soil, but if you can grow a salt-tolerant food product on that soil, you may turn a presently useless soil into something that can contribute to food supply. We need, where possible, we need to internalize resistance to insects and diseases to further reduce pesticide use. There are some possibilities for slowing down product deterioration. We know that fruits and vegetables, for example, which are some of the most nutrient-dense foods and which are not consumed in nearly large enough volumes among most low-income people, that those products have a very rapid product deterioration after being picked, and they contribute significantly to the food loss so in the world. So if we can do something to slow down that product deterioration, and so that we get a larger fraction of the harvested fruit and vegetables to market successfully, this would also be a net increase in reducing food losses and improvement in diets. And finally, particularly with application of modern electronic sensors and information science and information processing capacity, we can increase the precision and application of fertilizer nutrients and pest control media. We know that over-application of fertilizer and pesticides is bad economics, but it's also bad environmental practice. And we want to do everything we can to minimize these as we move to the future. Okay, now we're approaching the end of my presentation. I want to tie back now to the issue of poverty, because as we said, poverty reduction or poverty elimination is going to be essential if we're going to solve the poverty or solve the hunger problem. We cannot have zero hunger if we cannot solve the poverty problem. And I thought that former World Bank President Jim Yong Kim summarized very well and very succinctly some of the priorities for eliminating extreme poverty, or at least reducing it, as he saw it when he was bank president. His first priority was increase agricultural productivity. Remember that with 80% of the extreme poor living in rural areas, we have to solve the problem of poverty in agriculture and in rural areas if we're going to solve the poverty problem overall. And so by increasing agricultural productivity, we can both increase the earning potential of those farm families and also contribute to food security. Kim argued very well that we need to build infrastructure to provide access to energy, to irrigation, to markets. In fact, one of the biggest barriers to successful agricultural development in many parts of rural Sub-Saharan Africa is the poor state of rural roads, and as a result, the high cost of moving product from farm to market, and the impossibility of getting nutrient-dense products like fruits, vegetables, meat, milk from distant sources into urban markets. Kim argued we need to invest in health and education, especially in women and children. These are important in general, and I would flag in particular that health has two principal dimensions. One is health associated with good nutrition, with consuming a balanced diet, not suffering deficiencies in either energy, vitamins, minerals, or amino acids in the diet. Also, not over-consuming any of these either. The other dimension of health is, of course, controlling communicable diseases, but even the ability to control communicable diseases is not high if people are nutritionally compromised. Kim argued that we need to implement social safety nets and provide social insurance. What you and the food banks are doing is an important part of this. And Kim finally argued that we need to promote freer trade that provides greater access to markets for the poor and enables low and middle income country entrepreneurs to grow their distances and create jobs. This is freer trade with both among countries, but also within countries, because there are some large countries that impede free movement of food among their states or provinces, and can, as a result, you may end up with regionalized food insecurity if the surpluses of the abundant regions were shared more equitably with the poorer regions. Okay. Finally, to summarize and to cycle back to long-term prospects. We've argued that the world's farmers need to increase agricultural production at least 40% in the next 30 years, using less water and little, if any, more land than today. Early on, we pointed out that Malthus has been wrong for more than 2 centuries. And I will argue that there's no more reason for him to be right in the 21st century than in the 19th or 20th. However, he will continue to be wrong only if investments in agriculture development increase global agricultural production faster than demand grows. As we pointed out, Malthus was so wrong when he felt that food supply, literally inadequate food supply, literally starvation, would limit the size of the world's potential population. Instead, agricultural production grew for more than 2 centuries, slightly faster than global consumption of food, with the result that there was a slight negative trend in the real price of food after taking out the effects of inflation over more than 2 centuries. We're at the point right now where we're in a fairly delicate balance between global agricultural production and global food demand. And some years one gets a little ahead or behind the other, resulting in movements up and down in price. But to conclude, my last slide, if I can bring it up, is whether world food prices trend upwards, downwards, or sideways in the 21st century will depend on whether agriculture research increases land and water productivity faster, slower, or at the same speed as world demand for food grows. A long-term increase in the price of food resulting from underinvestment in agriculture research and agriculture development more broadly, a long-term increase in the real price of food would be devastating to low-income consumers who spend the largest fraction of their incomes on food. And as a result, we would see an increase in the incidence of hunger in the world. There is no excuse for this. We have the tools and the knowledge to avoid this undesirable outcome, but we have to make the right decision to ensure that we keep agriculture on our international development agenda, that we focus on minimizing poverty, eliminating it as soon as possible. At the moment, it looks quite unlikely, particularly after factoring in the effects of COVID-19, it looks quite unlikely that we'll be able to achieve a world of zero hunger and zero poverty by 2030, as the UN General Assembly set as an objective. But let's do everything we can to ensure that we get as close to that noble objective as possible. Thank you very much for having me today, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Bob, thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic. We're going to go ahead and move to Q&A now. And Bob, we did notice at the start of the session a little bit of feedback. So just to make sure we don't have that this time, I'm going to mute when you speak. And if you can mute when I speak, that would be great. But we've had several questions, starting with one from Alan Gilbertson, who used to be the board chair of GFN. And he had a question related to the crop yield gap chart. Does that allow for the quality of the land and water access? And he says, if yes, it seems that Sub-Saharan Africa has hope and that it could dramatically improve yields. So Bob, I'll let you speak to that.
Yes. In fact, it's, in my estimation, it's tragic that Sub-Saharan African agriculture has so seriously underperformed relative to its potential. For literally since colonial times. Now, we have to, in starting, recognize that the soils of Sub-Saharan Africa are probably the most eroded soils of the planet in terms of exhaustion of the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in the soil. Might say in the bad old days, when population was relatively sparse, Sub-Saharan Africa generally used the Swidden system or the slash and burn system of agriculture, where you slash down the forest, bring land into production, use up the nutrients in the soil, move on, let the land grow back up to brush or to forest, and eventually circle back around again. But as population has grown, those fallow periods have disappeared. And so we're pretty much exhausted that soil resource, used up the organic matter, used up the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So there's a huge need to what I call recapitalize the nutrient content of the Sub-Saharan African soil. But there's no reason it can't be done. We have the knowledge to do it. The other big limitation is the lack of rural roads. The cost of transporting inputs to farmers and moving their product from farm to market is exorbitant. And as a result, this destroys a lot of incentive to improve agricultural production practices. But there is no excuse for Sub-Saharan African agriculture to underperform continue underperforming. But it's a huge question mark, because as we've seen, with doubling of potential or likely doubling of population, urbanization, successful poverty reduction, demand for food in Sub-Saharan Africa is exploding. And there is more land in the savanna region, south and east of, say, Zimbabwe, southeast to Mozambique and back across to Angola. There is additional land that can be brought into production there if there's investment in rural roads. But I absolutely agree with the questioner. There's no reason that Sub-Saharan Africa couldn't be self-sufficient in food supply today, and likely ought to be able to meet much of its food demand in the future. But the big question is, will it?
Thanks, Bob. As a follow-up to that, someone has asked or made the point that many of the farmers, as you have, in Sub-Saharan Africa are subsistence, small-scale growers. And so the question is, or it's a comment, that making them pay for water, for irrigation, could have detrimental consequences because it cuts into that income. Is the case really for pricing water the same in Sub-Saharan Africa as it would be maybe in higher income parts of the world?
That is such a thorny question, and it's such a difficult issue. But we have to keep in mind that anything that's priced at zero will be wasted. I like to cite the example in northwestern India, where farmers not only have gotten water free, they even get electricity free to pump it out of the ground. But the aquifer in undergirding agriculture in northwestern India is receding in excess of the recharge rate. The agriculture production system of the Indo-Gangetic Plain is unsustainable. This is tragic. Another 500 million people to feed in South Asia, and with one of the most important breadbaskets becoming unsustainable because there's inadequate incentive to use the water that they use for the irrigation efficiently. I don't underestimate the difficulty of charging farmers for water where there's never been a tradition. But something's got to be done. Now, some places requiring the farmers that use the water to use sweat equity to help maintain the irrigation canals or the irrigation system can be a means of requiring some payment in kind or through labor. But the fact remains, there has to be some incentive to use the water that farmers use, at least in dry areas, efficiently. And remember, in Sub-Saharan Africa, I pointed out that really less than 5% of potential irrigation capacity has been developed. And so there's a huge potential to improve the availability of water to agriculture. But when that's done, there needs to be some attention to creating an incentive structure to be sure that the water's not misused because it's such a precious commodity.
Staying on this kind of focus again on small scale growers and how we can be supporting them to improve their situation. Someone has asked a question or made the point that farming yield improvement and farming employment seem to compete as you scale. Scale tends to improve yield, but reduces employment opportunities on farm. If this is correct, are there any thoughts about the future of this dissonance and its impact on poverty reduction?
Yes, I'm glad to respond to that important question. Let's be brutally frank. All the children growing up in rural poverty in South Asia and in Sub-Saharan Africa cannot escape poverty by staying in agriculture, period. The only way we can solve the rural poverty problem is for those who are in farming to have more resources with which to produce. That may be more land. And think of this, if you're in South and East Asia, the average farm holding is 1 to 2 hectares of land. Some places less than 1 hectare, 2.5 acres. Let's say you have 4 sons. Each of them wants to be a farmer. There's nothing you can grow on 1/2 acre or 1 acre land, except perhaps narcotics, and lift a family out of poverty. And that's certainly not what we're encouraging. There's no agricultural crop that is valuable enough per acre to lift all those families out of poverty. We have to find a way to move many of the children growing up in that rural poverty into non-farm jobs. Let me just cite one example from the United States that I think was very successful in our agriculture development. Universal public school education in rural areas and creating the land-grant university system, colleges of agriculture, meant that the children of farmers were able to meet the entry requirements for their land-grant university. Many of them studied agricultural sciences or agricultural engineering or agricultural economics, and they became the agricultural extension agents or the seed salesman or the lending officer or the engineer developing the next generation of tractor or more efficient combine. And as a result, those children of farmers who still speak the language of farmers, if you will, literally, were able to have a relatively easy transition away from agriculture, still contributing. I'm an example. I'm the oldest of 10 kids from a small family dairy farm. My parents put the highest priority in education, and I spent my life working related to agriculture, but not milking cows morning and night, 365 days a year like my father. Is that bad? No. It meant that when you have farm-raised children becoming productively employed in something related or unrelated to farming, it means that those who are left behind in farming have the potential to have a higher earning income per capita, and those that leave also have the potential to have a higher income. But without investing in those farmers' kids' education, it isn't going to happen. And remember, when I commented that 80% of the extreme poverty in the world is in rural areas, and said that more than half of those are women, half are kids, I also commented that the majority have little or no schooling. If those kids are not getting education that will enable them to escape from farming, we'll be in a downward spiral of increasing poverty as we further subdivide already sub-economically small production units, and poverty problem and associated hunger will only get worse.
Bob, there's been a couple of questions that I want to raise just about how we can get better support for agricultural development internationally. How does the world influence countries, specifically in South Asia and Africa, to make this a priority?
Leadership in developing countries has to come from the top. When I was Director of Agriculture and Rural Development at the World Bank, we were developing what were known as poverty reduction strategy papers. And at the same time, the World Bank was moving its country directors out to national capitals to get closer to the clients, to be more responsive to the developing countries' priorities. I have to admit that I was appalled that half of the poverty reduction strategy papers that came in from Sub-Saharan Africa never mentioned the word food or agriculture, period. No mention. You know, build a beltway around the national capital, build a subway in the national capital, invest in improved port capacity. But sadly, whereas in high-income countries, farmers seem to have disproportionate political clout and have great capacity to extract massive income transfers from their government. In low-income countries, farmers tend to be out there in rural areas, forgotten, not well organized in farm organizations, and have very little political clout. Most of the political clout resides in the cities. And to be modern in many developing countries has been seen to be industrial, to have skyscrapers, to have all the amenities of rural life or of urban life. And there's been gross underinvestment in rural development, particularly rural roads, but also in applied agriculture research. Every agro-ecosystem has its uniquenesses. The tools of agricultural science are footloose and can be moved across countries, applied in different countries, but they have to be applied to optimize the seeds, the cultural practices for the local agroecological conditions. And of course, remember that in today's world of climate change, those local agroecological conditions are migrating. So it's going to take more research investment just to sustain present productivity levels. So those of us that recognize the problem, we need to be advocates in our foreign aid programs. to help fill in the gaps. But national governments also have to recognize that they've got to walk the talk, or they've got to walk the talk and not just talk about the importance of poverty reduction. They've got to actually focus on reducing poverty where the majority of it resides, which is in rural areas. Now, as I indicated, with COVID-19, we've had a significant increase in urban poverty, and that's going to take significant response as well. But looking longer term, we've got to make sure that poverty reduction everywhere is going, including rural areas, is going to be essential. And with 4/5 of it out in rural areas, sustainable development goal number 1 will be unattainable unless we do what has to be done to eliminate rural poverty as well as urban poverty, to take full advantage of agriculture's potential to contribute to that rural poverty reduction, but also make sure we create opportunities for the kids growing up in that rural poverty to have a better life through doing something other than farming if they want to.
Well, that's a great segue to another question, really asking what, if anything, should change in US government policies. And I'm going to kind of broaden that to say, you know, those that are part of the G7 or even the G20, what can change with those policies to better meet some of these objectives that you've laid out, either in their countries or internationally?
Well, climate change is the issue of the day in the G7 and in our new administration in Washington. And it's essential that we keep agriculture very tightly linked into the climate change discussions. And with 2 aspects. I talked almost entirely about adaptation, but we do have to recognize that agriculture is a significant source of greenhouse gases as well, methane and nitrous oxide. And so agriculture has a role to play in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So, but we have to be sure that in the science, in applying the science to do this, that we make sure that we don't inadvertently diminish agriculture's production potential in the process of mitigating climate change. So that's one thing. The second is that we really have to keep emphasizing to our foreign aid community that the job isn't done. When food prices rise, it usually is possible to get agriculture back on the development agenda. This happened after 2008, 2009, when we had that world food price crisis. Agriculture had been slipping off the global development agenda for 10 or 15 years before that. We got it back on. President Obama went to the G7 and got a major commitment early in his first administration, and that was great. But it's slipping again, and as we get into a period of lower agriculture commodity prices, people tend to say, "Oh, we got the job done." We have to remember that when we're adding another Germany every year to global consumption needs, and as we successfully reduce poverty and have urbanization going on, we're putting the purchasing power in the hands of those larger populations to upgrade the quality of their diets. We've got significant growth in demand for food occurring, and as this gets ahead of production capacity, it pushes up the price of food. Then once we give agriculture attention, this brings down the price of food, and we just have to be sure that, particularly in this environment of greater variability of crop yields, we're probably going to see more volatility of agriculture and food prices, and we have to be sure that we don't allow ourselves get lulled into apathy by a transitory period of low prices. It won't stay there. The best, as the former Secretary of Agriculture in the United States once said, the best cure for low prices is low prices. The best cure for high prices is high prices. So we will have volatility. And we just have to keep our eye on the target, at least out to the middle of the century. We'll probably get close to zero population growth by then. But if we have poverty eliminated by then, hurrah, let's celebrate. But there'll be an awful lot higher demand for food as we're successful. So we have to keep the feet to the fire.
Great. We've got several more questions, Bob, we'll try to get to in our remaining 10 minutes or so. Someone has asked about the trade-offs on growing grains for food versus fuel. Obviously, grains are grown also for animal feed, but could also be grown for fuel. So what are your thoughts on that, given the enormous food demand for hunger facing the world?
Yes, an extremely important issue. You know, I'm a science optimist. If we invest enough in agriculture research to achieve the productive potential all around the world, not only to fully exploit the presently available technologies, but to take advantage of the tools of modern science to significantly increase the capacity even beyond that, then we probably could do it all, to use some agriculture production as feedstocks for biofuels. But I feel that we should only use food for fuel if we make a sufficient investment to agriculture research to grow that productive capacity sufficiently rapidly that we ensure that we can produce enough more food to feed the world's larger population better than today at reasonable cost, and do it in a manner that doesn't damage the environment. As I say, I'm a science optimist. I believe we could do it. We're not investing enough today to make it so. But if we make enough science investment, in fact, I guess that says that the advocates for biofuels ought to be some of the strongest advocates for productivity enhancing agricultural research in order to make it so that both they and we can achieve our objectives.
Someone has asked too if kind of going back to this idea of putting cost incentives on desirable behaviors. We have a question about can and should fiscal policies incentivize either nutritional eating or efficient eating, i.e. less meat because of the relatively high input costs or water needs?
I believe that consumer sovereignty will be allowed to prevail in most countries. I believe that carbon taxes would be an efficient way to elicit most environmentally desired behavior to minimize carbon or carbon dioxide accumulation in the atmosphere. I definitely believe that we're significantly underinvesting in production of nutrient-dense foods like fruits, vegetables, protein in general, both animal and plant. I don't believe that we should, by edict, tell people what they can and cannot eat, but I do think that we need to see a larger fraction of the world's animal protein supply coming from those species which have the highest feed conversion rates, like fish and poultry. But I guess I'm one who believes that government should allow consumer sovereignty, and if people want to eat meat, they should be allowed to, but it's not inappropriate to provide some greater incentive to produce the most efficient converters of feed into meat than the less efficient. But don't forget what I said about grazing lands. There's more land in the world that doesn't get enough rainfall to grow crops, that can grow grass, that cattle can convert into meat and milk. And there's nothing wrong with eating beef or drinking milk raised from cattle who are fed grass or who eat grass. And there are technologies being developed that'll reduce the methane emissions from those cattle, even grazing cattle.
Bob, on that point too, I know that obviously in higher income countries, there's a very significant amount of animal protein consumption. Can you just comment for a moment on animal protein consumption in lower income countries and whether or not you're seeing, is that sufficient? Are they consuming at the same rate as you would see in more affluent parts of the world?
Well, we observe in all countries and across income classes in all countries that as people gain purchasing power and they move from consuming mostly staples, rice, wheat, maize-based simple foods, that they tend to upgrade the quality of their diet by including more protein, more vegetables and fruits, also edible oils in the diet. And that seems to be behavior that's pretty typical across the world. Low-income people do suffer not only, in many cases, calorie deficiency, but certainly deficiencies in vitamins, minerals, especially when you think about the deficiencies, vitamin A, zinc, iodine, and iron are all widely identified nutrient deficiencies across the world. And we know it's difficult to get all the essential amino acids that your body can't synthesize from plant sources. It's not impossible, but it's actually a pretty sophisticated diet to get all the essential amino acids from a vegetarian diet. So clearly, low-income people need to upgrade the quality of their diet, including more vitamins, minerals, and animal protein. But it's only going to occur if they have the purchasing power to achieve that.
Wonderful. Well, Bob, this has been such an insightful conversation. I want to thank you so much for spending so much of your early morning with us. We are at time, and I would like to thank everyone for joining us today, for your questions. I'm sorry that we didn't have a chance to get to every question that has been asked. In closing, this session has been a very important part of our virtual Food Bank Leadership Institute and would only be made possible thanks to our sponsors, General Mills, HEB, Brambles, Cargill, the DLA Piper Foundation, Fundación Lala, and Ingredient. We will have the recording of this session available in both English and Spanish on our website. And I just want to close in thanking Dr. Thompson again, just for this incredibly valuable overview and frankly for your optimism that with the right investments, with the right action, that we will be able to meet both current and future food demand. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day or a good evening.